Every spring, without fail, on May 6th, I returned to the old train station in Galesburg, Illinois. Always the same bench, third from the left, facing the tracks that ran west toward Denver. I'd sit there quietly, my back straight despite the years, eyes fixed on the rusted rails. That's where she promised she'd return, and I promised I'd wait. The war had scattered us like ash in the wind. She was rushed onto a westbound train packed with women and children while I was shipped out to Europe. The night before she left, we stood on the platform in the cold spring air, both of us too young and too scared to know what would come next. She gripped my hands and whispered, "Wait for me here when this is over." Her voice cracked, but her eyes didn't waver. And I, not knowing what else to do, nodded. She disappeared into that train like a ghost, and I was drafted just 3 days later. I never saw her again, but I kept my word. Even after I returned home, wounded, quieter, not quite the same, I came back to that station every May 6th. At first, people thought I was waiting for a relative. Later, they thought I was crazy. But I wasn't waiting for a memory. I was waiting for her. I wore the same wool coat every year, though it stopped fitting properly after a while. I always brought daisies, her favorite, picked from the side of the road, never store-bought. And I always sat on that same bench, staring at every train that passed through, like it might carry her face in one of its windows. The town changed. The station aged, conductors retired, new faces came and went, but I remained. There were years I thought about giving up, when my joints hurt too much to walk, or when the silence of the platform felt heavier than the weight of all those lost decades. But then I'd close my eyes and hear her voice again, "Wait for me here." And so I did. Until one day, long after I'd stopped believing it would happen, the train screeched to a halt and the doors opened. If this story touches you the way it touched me to write it, please like and subscribe. It helps us keep sharing real stories that inspire, heal, and surprise. And now, get ready, because what happens next changes everything. It was the spring of 1941, and although the world hadn't fallen apart entirely, not yet, there was something in the wind. Something in the way the train whistles lingered longer in the air, and the way even the most ordinary afternoons felt like they might be our last, before everything changed. I was 19 years old, restless and proud, working as an apprentice mechanic under my uncle at the garage near Main Street, with oil-stained hands and the kind of naive ambition that made me believe I had all the time in the world to become something more. She was 17, bookish and bright, the daughter of a railroad man, raised between the rumble of freight cars and the sighs of departing engines, and though we'd grown up just blocks apart, it wasn't until that particular spring that our paths began to blur into one. I still remember the first time I truly saw her, not just noticed, not just waved across the church parking lot, but saw her sitting alone at the station bench, third from the left, with a book open in her lap and her hair tucked behind one ear in that absent-minded way she had when she was completely lost in a sentence. I was across the street, elbow deep in a stubborn engine, but my eyes kept drifting away from the work, drawn to the stillness she carried with her, a quiet gravity that didn't belong to small-town girls or this small-town life. When she finally looked up and caught me staring, she didn't smile or frown. She simply met my gaze as if to say, "I see you too," and then returned to her page. That was all it took. We became a secret rhythm. We walked the old paths behind the silos, sat on blankets beneath the grain elevator, whispered dreams we weren't sure we were allowed to have. She wanted to see the California coast, dip her feet in the Pacific Ocean, learn to write stories of her own someday. I wanted to drive across the country in something I'd fixed with my own hands, listening to jazz through a cracked dashboard radio, free of anything that felt like a cage. We were young, but it felt like more than young love. It felt like destiny disguised as summer afternoons and hushed conversations on the edge of the tracks. But the world doesn't stop turning just because two people fall in love. The newspapers grew heavier with war. Europe was bleeding, and we all knew America wouldn't stay untouched for long. Draft notices started arriving. Our town, like every other town, began to say its quiet goodbyes. Sons kissing mothers on porches, daughters folding letters into coat pockets, flags beginning to fly in front yards for reasons none of us celebrated. Then came the morning I found her at the station, not with a book this time, but with a suitcase, her mother clutching her wrist and her father pacing like a man who'd already said too much. I hadn't known she was leaving. Her father had arranged for her to go stay with an aunt in Colorado, somewhere safer, somewhere far enough west to escape the whispers of war. I stood there breathless, fingers trembling with motor oil and panic, watching as she turned to face me with eyes that already looked like goodbye. She broke from her mother's grip and ran to me, wrapping her arms around my waist like it might anchor her in place, burying her face in my chest as if she could stop time itself. "I didn't know how to tell you," she murmured, her voice small and sharp as broken glass. "I didn't want it to end like this." I cupped her face in both hands and tried to memorize everything. Every freckle, every line of worry across her brow, the way her breath caught in her throat before she spoke again. "Promise me something," she said. "When this is over, when all of it ends, you'll come back here, this station, this bench, and wait for me." There was no ceremony to the promise, no dramatic music. Just two kids standing in the shadow of a departing train, clutching hope like it was something solid, something real. I nodded, not because I understood what that kind of waiting would mean, but because I couldn't imagine not keeping that promise. "I will," I said, and I meant it in a way I'd never meant anything before. She kissed me once, soft, rushed, trembling, and then she was gone, swallowed up by the noise and the movement and the closing doors. 3 days later, I received my draft notice. I left for basic training with her voice echoing in my mind. Through the trenches of Europe, through nights of gunfire and mornings heavy with smoke, I held on to that moment, her breath against my neck, her hands pressed against my chest. And that promise neither of us had dared to write down, but both of us had carved into our bones. When I came back, older, quieter, missing 2 fingers and a piece of my heart, I returned to that station. It was May 6th. I sat on the 3rd bench from the left with a small bouquet of daisies in my lap, and I waited. She didn't come that year, or the year after, or the 10 that followed, but I never stopped showing up. People whispered, called me foolish, pitied the mechanic who waited too long for a girl who'd surely forgotten, but they didn't understand. I hadn't just promised her I'd wait. I'd promised myself that love could outlast anything, even war, even silence, even time. When the train pulled me away from home and into the grip of war, I remember thinking that the last real thing I had touched was her hand, and the last true sound I had heard was her voice, whispering through tears that I should wait for her at the station when it was all over. I carried that memory like a relic, tender, fragile, sacred, tucked somewhere beneath the dog tags around my neck and the growing ache in my chest that told me I might never see home again, at least not the version I knew. I arrived at the base in Georgia first, where the sun burned hotter than I'd ever felt, and the nights were loud with the shouting of boys who were trying not to be afraid. We trained in dust and sweat and silence, all of us pretending to be men, even the ones who already had wives or children, because deep down we knew that none of us were prepared for what waited across the ocean. And when the orders came, I boarded a ship that took me further away from everything I'd ever called mine. In France, then Belgium, then Germany, the world changed shape. Towns disappeared overnight. Names lost their meaning. The sky, once something I used to watch with wonder, became a canvas for smoke and fire. I learned how to march through snow with blisters that never healed. I learned the sound a man makes when he dies with his eyes open. I learned that the cold can take a finger before you even feel the pain. And that's how I lost 2 of mine, just gone one morning outside Kursk, wrapped in bandages I barely remember. But through it all, I held on to her. I wrote to her more than I wrote to anyone else, even though I had no address, no mailbox to send it to. Just the name of the station, the bench, the hope. Every letter began the same way. I'm still waiting, just like I promised. I described things I couldn't say out loud to the other men. I confessed fears I would never admit under the weight of a uniform. In those pages, I was still myself. I was still hers. But the silence was brutal. No reply ever came, not even a sign. No returned letters, no message passed through town, no telegram. Just the quiet and the grinding metal of tanks, and the long nights where I wondered whether she had forgotten me, or worse, whether she had come back to the station one day and found only the wind. When the war finally ended, I didn't feel victorious. I felt empty, hollowed out by things I could never explain to the people back home. I stepped off the train in Illinois with a limp in my step and a heaviness in my chest that no medal could balance. The first place I went wasn't my house, or the shop, or the church where my mother still lit candles for the living and the lost. I went straight to the station. I sat on the bench, third from the left. I looked out at the tracks, waiting for the train from the west. She didn't come, but I came back the next year, and the one after that. I didn't tell anyone why I did it. At first, I wore my old uniform. I still had the coat, though it hung looser than before. I brought daisies like she liked, sat there in silence, just sat. Some station workers nodded at me like they understood, though no one asked. A few years later, someone left a cup of coffee beside me. Then another year, someone brought a chair because my knees had started to go. The station aged, and so did I. Paint peeled from the walls. New conductors replaced the old. Timetables changed. But I never missed a year, May 6th, like clockwork. The same bench, the same flowers, the same wait. People started to call me the quiet man on the bench. Some thought I was delusional. Others romanticized it, like some great love story. But it wasn't about romance anymore. It was about a promise, about something pure that I made in the midst of chaos, and how that kind of promise becomes the only compass you have when everything else falls apart. There were moments I doubted, of course there were. I'd stare at the empty tracks and think, maybe she's gone, maybe she married, maybe she forgot me, or maybe she died and I'll never know. But even in the doubt, I stayed, because love doesn't always need certainty. Sometimes it only needs endurance, and so I endured. Then, one spring, decades later, everything changed. It was early spring of 1961, when everything I thought I had accepted, the silence, the absence, the not knowing, was suddenly shattered by the discovery of something so small, so fragile, and yet so undeniable that I felt my world tilt on its axis once again, as if time itself had circled back to whisper, "She's not gone." I was at the station, as always, sitting on the same bench, third from the left, dressed in the same coat I wore every May 6th, holding the same bouquet of daisies in my lap, when a woman I didn't recognize, a station clerk, or a volunteer perhaps, approached me slowly, holding something in her hands with a kind of reverence that made my chest tighten before she even said a word. "I think this might belong to you," she said, her voice careful, almost apologetic, as if she was handing me a memory too delicate to carry. What she placed in my hands was a small, yellowed envelope, the kind used to store old photographs. I opened it with fingers that trembled despite the years of soldiering, despite all the cold I'd endured in Europe, and slid out a faded photograph that stopped my heart with the precision of a sniper's bullet. It was her, standing in front of what looked like a modest farmhouse, her hair pinned up, her eyes unmistakable, even after all those years. But that wasn't what shook me to my core. It was the child in her arms, a boy, maybe 4 or 5 years old, with dark hair and the kind of uncertain smile that children wear when asked to pose for strangers. On the back of the photo, in her handwriting, still the same elegant and slanted, were just 10 words. For Jay, if you are still waiting. I remember. No date, no address, no explanation. Just a signature of hope wrapped in mystery. My knees buckled beneath me as I sat back down on the bench, the photo resting in my lap like a relic from a life that could have been mine. She was alive, or at least she had been, and she had remembered. She had thought of me, maybe even tried to find me. The station clerk, noticing my silence, simply nodded and walked away, as if she knew this was not a moment for words. The days that followed were a blur. I studied every inch of the photograph, looking for clues. The shape of the porch behind her, the tilt of the trees in the distance, the pattern on the boy's shirt, as if some secret message might be hidden in the background. I began visiting other towns along the railway, carrying the photo like a passport to my past, showing it to station masters, librarians, diner waitresses, anyone who might have seen a woman like her or remembered a boy with eyes like mine. I traveled farther than I'd gone in years, sleeping in motels with flickering neon signs, waking each morning with the same mix of hope and dread churning in my gut. Sometimes I thought I saw her in crowds, in the way a woman turned her head, or the rhythm of a voice across the room, but it was always someone else, always, almost. I began writing down everything. Towns I visited, names people gave me, dates that meant nothing until they might someday mean everything. My notebook became a map of maybes, a record of longing. There were nights when I stared at the ceiling, wondering if the boy in the photo was mine, wondering if she had written me letters that never found me, wondering if she had come to the station one year, and I had missed her by minutes. The what-ifs clung to me like shadows, multiplying in the dark, but I couldn't stop. I wouldn't, because she had sent the photo, because she had remembered. That alone was enough to ignite the fire again, in a heart that had learned to survive on embers. Years passed. The photo remained in my wallet, worn soft at the edges, but still powerful enough to stop me in my tracks whenever I looked at it. I stopped expecting miracles, but I never stopped searching. My hair turned grey, my hands grew stiff, but every May 6th I returned to the bench, and every year I laid the photo beside the bouquet of daisies, just in case someone else needed to see it, just in case she came back and wondered if I had ever stopped waiting. I didn't, because the truth was, I didn't need certainty anymore. I didn't need guarantees. I just needed to believe that some part of her was still out there, that the promise we had made on that platform in 1941 still lived in the quiet corners of her memory the way it lived in mine. And then, one May morning, something happened, but that's a story for the next train. It was May 6th, 1987, and by then the world had changed in more ways than I could count or name. The station had been repainted twice, the benches replaced once, though the third one from the left, the one I always returned to, still bore a faint scratch in the wood where my pocket knife had once carved her initials beside mine, not for anyone to see, just for me, just so I could remember that it had been real. My hair had thinned, my knees ached in the cold. I walked with a cane now, the one the VA gave me, its rubber tip worn down from years of use, but my steps still led me to that platform every spring, without hesitation, without question, as though my body itself had learned the ritual long after my faith had begun to fray. That morning I rose earlier than usual. The sky outside my window was soft, with the kind of grey that feels full of meaning, as if the clouds themselves are holding their breath. I dressed in silence. Same wool coat, pressed the night before, same hat, slightly bent at the brim, same bouquet of daisies, gathered by hand from a roadside patch I'd nurtured for years now, as if the act itself could summon something sacred. I walked slower than I used to, pausing every few blocks to breathe, to listen, to feel the weight of time settling gently across my shoulders. At the station, I nodded to the clerk behind the counter, a young man who barely looked old enough to shave. let alone understand what it meant to wait for something you once held in your arms and lost to history. Still, he offered me a quiet smile, and I knew without words that someone had told him. They always did. I sat. Third bench from the left, set the daisies beside me. Checked my watch. 11:06. The train from Chicago was due at 11:12. The minutes passed slowly, each one stretching long and silent like the pause between heartbeats. I thought about leaving, truly leaving, for the first time in years. Thought about what it would feel like to finally let go, to stop showing up, to let the wind take whatever pieces of hope still clung to me. But then I looked down at the flowers in my lap, at the coat folded neatly at my side, and I heard her voice again, not loud, not dramatic, but soft and steady, the way she said it that day in 1941. Wait for me here. And so I waited. At 11:12 on the dot, I heard it. The sound of the train, a low hum at first, then louder, rolling in like thunder beneath the ground, shaking the platform in a way that always stirred something deep inside me. The brakes squealed as it slowed, metal grinding against metal, the familiar hiss of steam rising into the morning air. The doors clattered open and people stepped out. A man with a suitcase, a woman with a baby stroller, a teenager with headphones, an elderly couple arguing softly over a map. One by one they passed me, eyes glazed with travel, with schedules, with destinations. I kept watching. My fingers clenched the cane tighter. My heart didn't race, not yet, not anymore. Too many years had passed for hope to rise too fast. Then I saw her. At the far end of the platform, stepping down from the last car, moving slowly, cautiously, as if unsure the ground beneath her feet was real. She wore a soft blue scarf, the kind she used to tie around her hair when we sat near the silos, back when we were young and certain. Her hair, now silver, was still thick, still pulled back with the same gentle care. She carried a small suitcase, battered and worn, and in her free hand a single daisy. She paused at the base of the steps and looked around, not hurriedly, not frantically, but as if she expected to find me, as if she knew. When her eyes met mine, I stopped breathing. She didn't smile at first, neither did I. We simply stared, two ghosts finally meeting in the daylight, as if the decades between us had folded into this one fragile second. Then she began to walk. Each step she took echoed through my bones. I rose, slowly, with effort, with fear, and stood there gripping my cane like it might hold up the entire world. I wanted to speak, to say her name, but my mouth had gone dry. It was she who spoke first. "Michael?" Her voice cracked, but it was hers. I nodded. "Anna." She stepped closer. "You're here," she whispered. "I never left." Tears welled in her eyes, not loud, not dramatic, just soft, silent, shimmering beneath the lines time had etched across her face. "I always hoped," she said. "I never knew if you'd still be." "I am," I said, "and I've been waiting." And then, without another word, she wrapped her arms around me. Not tightly, not desperately, but gently, like she was afraid she might break me if she held on too hard. I let the cane fall. I dropped the daisies. I held her. We stood there, two old souls finally stepping out of a dream and into something real. The station faded around us. The trains, the passengers, the past. And all that remained was the promise we had kept. We live now in a small white house not far from the tracks. The same line still runs west to Chicago and east through fields that haven't changed much since the days when boys went off to war with promises tucked into their pockets and girls waited with fingers crossed and hearts quietly breaking. The station is quieter these days. The benches have been replaced again. The old ticket booth is now a coffee stand run by a girl who reminds me a little of her, not because she looks the same, but because she listens with the same kind of patience. Anna and I built something in the aftermath of silence. We didn't try to rush the years we had lost. We let them stay where they were, in the shadows. Instead, We filled the days we had left with small, sacred routines, mornings with tea and crossword puzzles, afternoons walking through our garden, evenings sitting by the window and watching the last train pass, its lights flickering like ghosts across the wall. We didn't need much. After everything, we knew how to live with little and still feel full. She told me about the farm where she had been hidden, how her father had died not long after she left, how her mother had grown ill, and how she had stayed in Colorado with an aunt who didn't like to talk about the past. She told me she had tried to write many times, but never knew where to send the letters, especially after her aunt moved them to another town and changed their last name out of fear. She said she used to dream about the bench at the station, and sometimes she imagined me sitting there, aging without her, and it hurt too much to think that she might be the reason for that kind of loneliness. She told me about her son, the boy in the photo. His name was Matthew. He had my eyes, she said, and my stubbornness. He had grown up, gone to school, built a life of his own. She didn't tell him about me, not at first, but she showed him the picture one day, the one she had sent to the station, and when he saw how I had waited all those years, he cried. I told her everything too. About the frostbitten winters in Europe, the friends I buried in silence, the days I thought I wouldn't make it home, and the years I spent on that bench, watching every train and imagining her face behind every window. I told her how the daisies became a ritual and how strangers would bring me coffee or simply sit beside me in silence because they didn't know what to say, but understood that something mattered there. We didn't mourn the years we lost. We honored them. Every May 6th, we go back to that station together. I wear the same coat, though it no longer fits well, and she wears her soft blue scarf, tied gently beneath her chin like she used to. We sit on the third bench from the left, holding hands like teenagers too shy to admit they're in love. We watch the trains come and go. We say hello to the station clerk. We place a single daisy on the bench before we leave, for the years we missed, for the promises that waited patiently in silence. And when people ask, because they always do, we tell them the story, not with sadness, but with pride. Because we're not just two old people who found each other again. We're proof that some promises are stronger than war, stronger than time, stronger than forgetting. We're proof that waiting isn't always foolish. Sometimes it's the most faithful thing a heart can do. We've written it all down now. For Matthew, for his children, for anyone who might wonder whether love can survive the distance between one goodbye and another. We tell them it can, that sometimes the waiting itself becomes the love. Because it was never about the bench, or the station, or the daisies. It was about keeping a door open, even when the house had burned down, about listening for footsteps long after the music stopped, about believing in the impossible, not because you're naive, but because you once held something true and you weren't ready to let it go, and because sometimes it really does come back. We have new stories every day. True stories that touch and inspire. If this one moved you the way it moved me to write it, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who still believes in the power of memory and love.